As a shipper, are you being strategic with your transportation system and model, or is it short-sighted? Okay? So I asked you to be on because I have a huge amount of respect for how you operate and how you treat people and the level that you hold yourself to as well as your providers. And I think that in itself is the foundation that you establish with everyone you work with. So, we've seen the market over the past few years, the COVID market, which nobody'd ever seen before.
Mhm.
You saw a lot of capacity crunch when you see acceptance rates and decline rates on tenders in the 40s and 45% for extended period of time. There's just not enough capacity for the crazy demand that we had in COVID. And I think a lot of people threw money at it at that point in time, or had to, because they didn't have a successful model for the tough times, right?
Right.
So I look at it personally and professionally like, if you wouldn't do it with your own finances, why would you do it with your companies, right?
Right.
It's easier to risk and to take risks with other people's money because it's not yours. And now we're on the back end of that where I think the past year plus, I'm going to say 15 months, we've seen a declining market. You saw many people go back to what they were doing beforehand, which is trying to figure out the cheapest options, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to get it back, right? The tit for tat, the retaliatory behavior. I think we're seeing that. But I think the real strategic players aren't the majority, which, maybe this brings value to everyone in the industry. Maybe it doesn't. But what are your thoughts on strategic versus short-sighted?
I think as a shipper, we have to be mindful that, we do things for the customer. Um, and a lot of times we allow that relationship to control the narrative of how we execute things like transportation. Um, and because of the lack of strategy, and I find that transportation tends to be a little bit further down the list of priorities to focus on when it comes to, let's say, medium-sized companies. I think the older, more established, larger companies understand the value that exists with strategy. But for those that are smaller and growing, they really just haven't learned that lesson yet. And I think COVID was a bit of a spanking for that. But for shippers that do view the strategy as a model to follow, as well as thinking of shippers as more of a partner. I mean, when you deliver something on the behalf of a shipper, you are representing that shipper. So I think that relationships are really important. And although COVID was a challenge for me, it wasn't as much of a challenge for other shippers, it wasn't as much of a challenge for me as it was for other shippers, because I do view transportation as a
Partnership.
strategic partner. And, yes, I did see some pricing go up, but as soon as they were able to bring it down, the pricing came down. I did recognize it will never be back to probably the levels that we may have been used to. Just like after 9/11, we saw prices go up real high, and they haven't gone back down from that either. So, I do think that for people that aren't established in this industry, that they don't really understand the ebbs and flows of the industry and what the drivers are that cause those costs to go up. So when you're looking from a strategic standpoint, you have to understand those drivers and manage those as the relationship goes along, so that whenever there's a pandemic or a huge flooding or a fire or a hurricane, you've got a partner to navigate those problems, and therefore that doesn't affect your customer. And that's ultimately the goal, right? Is to not affect your customer.
But with the big shipper, you brought up the smaller and the medium size where it's
Mhm.
down on the list. I think the bigger the shippers have become in some of these organizations, they say they want a partner, but they want the partner to be at the lowest cost.
Well, that's not being a partner, right? So I think that has more to do with the leadership than the size of the company.
And they say that's strategic.
Yeah, but it's not.
It's strategic in one respect. It's strategic about driving a lowest cost model,
Mhm.
not a value lowest cost scenario, or most value for the most equitable number, right?
Yeah, and
So
we were just talking about this concept earlier this week that, there's a difference in leadership and how they execute these types of things if they are more finance focused rather than operationally focused. So, and I'm not knocking one or the other. I'm
right,
just saying that
you
there's a
need
different
both,
approach.
right?
There's a different approach. And if you're more of an operations background, you understand that there's these intangible costs for not delivering on time. Unless you've got a delivery that finds you, right, for OTIF. But there's all these costs that are intangible when you're doing your budget that if you don't deliver, how do you budget that? So you have to have a broader perspective rather than just the budget or just the price, because if anything COVID taught us was that there are a lot of costs associated to customer service. And if we only focus on the price, then we're just going to end up costing ourselves more money. We're throwing a dollar to chase a penny. And I do think that there has to be some contingency planning when you're doing budgets, but ultimately, you have to have a top-down leadership that says, I recognize that it can't always be about the penny. You want it to be, we have shareholders, we have investors, we have all these people that we have to report to, but at the end of the day, we have to report back to the customer, right? That's why we're here. So I tend to push a little harder on things like that, but I know that there are bigger companies, there are smaller companies that that leadership just doesn't align with that mindset. They might, but maybe that doesn't get pushed down to the levels it needs to get pushed down to. So, I can only speak from my perspective. I can't speak from, those other perspectives, but that's just traditionally what I've seen in my environments.
But I think it takes a strong leader from transportation.
Oh, yeah.
If you have strong push from an accounting perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you say, hey, we're going to save money in doing a bid. We know that. But I think the strategic approach is we're going to save money, but we're going to improve our network so that when the disaster happens, or the flood, or we're fighting FEMA against FEMA competition or capacity for whatever reason, COVID, pandemic, you name it. I think that the intelligent and strategic approach would be, how do we not put ourselves back in this position again? And instead, we're seeing the majority of shippers say we're trying to get it back.
Yeah.
That we're talking to that we don't have a relationship with. So there's two different things that I look at. Somebody that's an unknown, and I'm an unknown to them, right? So they don't understand our business model. Where if you set me up for failure, I'm going to call you and say, hey, can we get some lead time on this? Because Friday night at 8 p.m. is not putting me in a position to do the right job for you from a cost perspective. And it sets an unrealistic precedent with the carriers, right?
Well, and it sets unrealistic expectations of the customer, right? I mean, there have been many a times I've made a phone call at 5 o'clock on a Friday to a carrier to say, hey, I need help.
Right.
But I also didn't tell the customer, that's normal transit 3 days away, that, hey, it's going to be there Saturday morning. That is all about the customer relationship. You can say, yes, I understand you're upset, and yes, I can't, you have every valid reason to feel the way you feel, but that doesn't change the fact that I cannot get this load across the country in an overnight shipment unless I'm flying the Enterprise. And
Right.
I think there's a level of value to that honesty, right? We have to be honest with what we can do. hey, we screw up, we own that. We have to do what we got to do to fix it. But you can't push that on the carrier who can't realistically make those expectations because you didn't manage it beforehand. So I think I understand that we use transportation as a cost of goods. We have to do it. It is expensive. I get that. But having an upset customer is much more expensive than another, penny or so on the mile. It just is. So, I don't think that there's a way to look at that or to value that in a way that speaks to the people that make these decisions. And you do need a strong person in transportation that has the vernacular, that can speak to the audience that they're speaking to, and that can communicate it in a way to get them to understand. So it's not only about leadership skills, but it's also about communication skills.
The short-sighted part of this that always seems to get in the way, especially in a market that we're in now, we're seeing freight rates move at unsustainable numbers right now. And we know those ebbs and flows can happen. The extremes of them are determined by the volatility and capacity.
Well, and as a shipper, it's pipe dream, right? As a shipper, you want some sort of forecasting capability to know what that's doing. And unless you've got your ear onto the chats, you've got, the technology in front of you that tells you everything that's going on in each area of the country, it's really hard to throw resources at that, right? Because what's the return on that?
Right.
And that's where you have to rely on your relationship with your carrier, your broker, to be that representative for you. And again, that comes into the strategic partnership, right? Yes, you understand they have to make money off of the relationship, but those quarterly updates on what's going on in the market, being prepared for holidays, being prepared for cultural events, being prepared for weather, that takes a lot of energy. And, the bigger companies, I like to think, have resources to do that. Whether or not they allocate those resources instead of everybody's hair being on fire is another story. But that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of intuition, and it takes a lot of history in the industry that, I don't know that really exists as you and I kind of go further in our careers as we get older. Everything has changed so much, and a lot of people are retiring out of the industry, and transportation is just not that sexy. So how do you recruit
What?
people
Come
to train them
on.
to do that?
Come
I mean,
on.
except for you, of course,
Come
that the hair,
on.
you're doing the hair thing today. Yeah. So I missed the wig.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that one up.
Continue watching on the next episode of the Stay in Your Lane podcast.